Hi students, this video lecture covers actually a little bit of 3 sections, but very little bits because I just take some of the basic information of each section and I'm just going to share with you what at this point you should know. So we start in this video talking about eukaryotic cells in general, and then we talk about the nucleus of a eukaryotic cell. And then we will finish talking about the energy producing organelles of the cell where certain processes takes place. All right, so in the lab, this past lab, when we were looking at the microscope, working with the microscope, at the end of the lab, some of you took cheek samples and looked at the cell under the microscope, and others of you took onion skin. And so I've put up images actually of those two things. And the reason I'm showing it to you is because both of these represent the second group of molecule that we're the second group of cell that we're talking about, which are eukaryotic cells. In our last video lecture, we talked about prokaryotic cells. Now we're talking about eukaryotic cells. So if you can look at these pictures, hopefully you recognize this from what you saw. And the one thing I want you to realize is both of these plant and animal cells are eukaryotic cells. They both, and you can see this here, have a membrane-bound nucleus. You can see the darker purple on the right of these cheek cells, which are animal cells. We are animals. And the left, you can see lighter little circles from the plant cells. And so we're going to talk about the differences between these eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. So, as shown here, eukaryotic cells have a membrane-bound nucleus. And that nucleus contains the DNA. How is the DNA housed in a prokaryotic cell? If you remember, there was no actual structured nucleus. The DNA was just kind of tightly raveled in the center of the prokaryotic cell. I had shown you a picture of bacteria. Also, eukaryotic cells are much larger than prokaryotic cells. If we were looking at bacteria under a microscope, it would not look this large. Okay, so eukaryotic cells are much larger. Eukaryotic cells also are what we refer to as compartmentalized, meaning they have compartments. The way I explain compartments is that a house has compartments in the form of rooms, like different parts and different activities occur in each of those compartments. For example, in the bathroom, people shower, they go to the bathroom. In the kitchen, they cook. Well, eukaryotic cells are similar. They have these structures called organelles that are little compartments inside. And that's kind of an advancement from prokaryotic cells because it allows multiple things to be going on in the cell at the same time. So we refer to that as compartmentalization. And that's written here now. So eukaryotic cells contain little compartments, and we call those organelles. And we're going to talk about a few of them in this video lecture. And in those organelles, there's certain functions that are performed. And so the advancement in this is that it allows a cell to do multiple things at the same time, because in one compartment, maybe we need it to be really acidic and have certain enzymes. And in another compartment, we need it to be really basic, right? So we're separating those two areas. Eukaryotic cells are also not as ancient as prokaryotic cells. If you recall, I said prokaryotic cells evolved first, and from there evolved eukaryotic cells. So there is a theory of how eukaryotic cells came to be, and this is referred to as the endosymbiotic theory. So this explains how eukaryotic cells evolved. And recall that in biology, a theory is actually something that has been tested over and over, and we have large amounts of evidence to support. So we talked about the scientific method, and someone has a hypothesis, and that's testable, and they test it, and they come up with a conclusion. Well, if many scientists all over the world are testing a hypothesis about how eukaryotic cells evolved, and they all came up with evidence for the same conclusion, then it becomes a theory. So that's a little different than how we use theory in everyday language when we say, oh, I have a theory about this. But in science, a theory has to be supported by large amounts of evidence. So in the theory of endosymbiosis, if you look at the top here, and I'm just going to kind of explain it very briefly, superficially. There was an original prokaryotic cells. Remember, those evolved first. They did not have membrane-bound nucleus. And the cell membrane, the outer membrane, started kind of folding inward. It kind of started making folds, and the membrane started going inside of the cell until it, in a way, surrounded the DNA. And that's how they think the membrane-bound nucleus evolved. And then from there, other small prokaryotic cells, you can see here it says aerobic bacterium, so a little bacteria that used oxygen pushed inward into that cell, and another photosynthetic one pushed inward, and that could have evolved the animal cell and the plant cell. And so basically, the idea is these eukaryotic cells were made from folding inward of the membrane to surround the nucleus, and then smaller prokaryotic cells like little bacteria going inside of it and staying in there and helping the cell survive. And so that led to a symbiotic relationship, a relationship where they both benefited, and that's how the eukaryotic cell evolved. I'm hopefully going to put a little video about this on my Blackboard as well. So the nucleus, right, we refer to it as the command center. Why? Because that's where the DNA is. And the DNA is the instructions for how to make all the proteins a cell requires, right? So the nucleus is a command center. It's in the middle, and it's has what we call a nuclear envelope, which is like a membrane. And we're going to learn about membrane in this module as well. But a membrane, if you look at this picture down here, you see this that's labeled phospholipid. A membrane is made up of the molecule lipids, particularly phospholipids, forming a bilayer. And they form this envelope around the DNA, and this envelope has little pores, little openings where things can go in and out. The ribosomes are an organelle that actually prokaryotic cells have as well. So that's the one organelle, right, that we find in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, and that's where proteins are produced. They're these little yellow structures, and in a way it makes sense that they both have them because all cells need proteins in order to function. And for now, that's really all I'm going to tell you about it. It's a site of protein synthesis. Next, we go to the organelles, or the compartments that have to do with converting energy to a usable form for the cell. So like sometimes we refer to these as the powerhouse of the cell. So the first one, the chloroplast, is found in plants and algae, some protists. All right, and so the chloroplast is the structure, if you've ever heard of the process photosynthesis, right? So photosynthesis is what plants can do that animals cannot. They can actually use energy from the sun and convert that energy into an organic molecule, like a carbohydrate, like a sugar, right? We can't do that. We can't sit out in the sun and take that sun's energy and convert it into sugars. But plants can do that, okay? So they do that in a structure called the chloroplast. So the chloroplast captures that sun's energy and converts it into a carbohydrate, like glucose. So in addition to sun's energy, photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide and water and light and makes food, right? Glucose. So the carbon dioxide is like the carbon for, remember the glucose, the monosaccharides are those like ring structures. And so with sunlight, carbon dioxide, water, the plant can make food, can make glucose. That's why plants are also good for reducing of climate change and reducing carbon dioxide levels, because they actually suck carbon dioxide out of the air, whereas we release it into the air. So that's the chloroplast. The mitochondria as the other energy producing cell. So the mitochondria is found actually in almost all eukaryotic cells, animals, plants, all of them. So the mitochondria now uses oxygen, okay? So when we breathe, why do we need to breathe in? Because we need oxygen to reach all of our cells. And that oxygen is used in the mitochondria. And that oxygen converts, remember we talked about glucose being energy source in our blood? Well, that glucose goes into our cells, and with oxygen, that glucose gets converted into a molecule called ATP, and ATP is what actually our cells can use. I always make the analogy of like glucose being a $100 bill. And if you go into some stores and you give them a $100 bill, they're going to say, that's too big. You can't buy a pack of gum that's $1 with a $100 bill. So that's kind of the analogy I make. Glucose is like the $100 bill. ATP is like the single dollar, right? A single dollar you can use anywhere, right? Everyone will take a single dollar. That's ATP. The glucose is the $100. And so in the mitochondria, the $100 bill, that glucose is converted into the single dollars, into the ATP. All right. Plants also have mitochondria. They take the glucose that was made in the chloroplast by photosynthesis and convert it to ATP, the single dollars. So the process of cellular respiration, that's what it's called, right? It uses glucose, it uses oxygen to make ATP, and carbon dioxide is produced as waste. So this kind of explains why we need to breathe to get oxygen, why we need to eat to get glucose, and then why we need to exhale, release carbon dioxide to produce this molecule called ATP that is used in our cells for all sorts of processes. All right, that's it for the content. So in this lecture, we've covered eukaryotic cells, how they evolved, right? We explained how they're different than prokaryotic cells. We talked about the nucleus. We talked about ribosomes that are actually in both eukaryotic and prokaryotic. We talked about mitochondria, and we talked about the chloroplast.